Previously on this channel, we've examined Jordan Peterson's belief that Christianity is the source of morality, that the word truth actually means, or should mean, that which serves life, and we've also seen him tiptoe around the historical and theological claims that Christianity actually makes. In this video, I'm going to try and make sense of these beliefs, and to explain how they all work together to create what I believe is Jordan Peterson's overarching worldview with regard to society and religion. But first, let's take a quick recap of what we've seen so far. First is Jordan Peterson's morality.
Yes, you can be a non-believer, but the funny thing about that is, too, you can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, you know. This is the argument that I tried to level at Sam Harris with regards to the metaphysical foundations of his ethics. It's like, it's the same sort of thing, and I think Ben Shapiro just went after him on the same grounds, is that I don't care what you say about whether or not you're an atheist, you act like you're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so you think you don't believe, but I think you do. But we have different definitions of what the word believe means. Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. The ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact mid-air without any foundational support.
Next we have Jordan Peterson's Christianity. So
people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. Strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now, you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? For all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible.
But do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead?
I don't believe that it's reasonable to boil it down to something like, do you believe that or do you not believe it? You know, we don't know what we're capable of, I suppose, is the final answer. And so I'm unwilling, for a variety of reasons, which I can't explain. They're tangled up with experiences that I've had that I can neither understand nor explain. But I'm unwilling to rule out the existence of heaven. I'm unwilling to rule out the existence of life after death. I'm unwilling to rule out the idea of universal redemption and the defeat of evil.
And finally, we have Jordan Peterson's definition of truth.
Your concept of truth is collapsing everything back to whether we survive.
Right.
Presumably whether we survive happily, right?
No, just whether or not we survive.
We can't wait around to see if everyone dies to find out if we're making sense in the present.
Sure. The thing is, Sam, we do think about it that way already. We think about it that way all the time. We think, well, messing around with smallpox is probably a bad idea because it might be fatal. Anytime we have any inkling that the outcome of a scientific experiment might be catastrophe on the broadest possible scale, we immediately decide that that's a bad
Well,
idea.
of course, but that again, that's not has nothing to do with epistemology. That has to do with danger and survival and risk and things that worry us.
Right, which I would say are higher truths. So it does have something to do with epistemology.
You can call them higher values, but they're not truth in the sense that when it comes time to have an honest conversation about the factual accuracy of any statement, about whether or not something is likely to be true, when you're talking about probabilistic truth, there you're not talking merely about the risk of species annihilation.
I know, that's because you leave that question out of the realm of consideration.
And for good reason.
Well, for good proximal reason, but maybe for bad distal reason.
But for most things we want to talk about, there is no implication of danger on that scale at all. And yet we still have to make strong truth claims.
To a new viewer, these beliefs may seem unusual. It's difficult to see how these beliefs fit together, and it's difficult to understand why anyone would so adamantly defend Christianity while simultaneously tiptoeing around it. However, I think there is a simple explanation for how these beliefs fit together and build off of each other. There's just one last piece to the puzzle. That piece is Jordan Peterson's belief that Christianity acts like a kind of vaccine or placeholder belief, which he claims prevents something called ideological possession and the tyranny and death that comes with it. This is how he explains the infamous dictators of the 20th century. As people became less religious, they became nihilistic, which left them vulnerable to any ideology which promised order. This is a belief which Peterson has asserted many times, and it's closely related to his attempt to redefine the word truth.
The truth value of a proposition can be evaluated whether or not this is a fact worth knowing or whether or not it's dangerous to know.
No, but that's the thing I don't agree with, because I think that that's the kind of conception of what constitutes a fact that does in fact present a moral danger to people, a mortal danger to people. And I also think that that's partly why the scientific endeavor, as it's demolished the traditional underpinnings of our moral systems, has produced an emergent nihilism and hopelessness among people that makes them more susceptible to ideological possession. Not all truth is empirical truth. In fact, the fundamental truths, as far as I can tell, paradoxically enough, are Darwinian, and they actually line up with religious truths, which is the point I've been trying to make when I discuss such issues with people like Sam Harris. Like, Sam is a very, very smart guy, but he worships the intellect. That's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is that I was never able to push him to his solution. He'd never let me go there because, his idea is that we could rationally order society so that the well-being of people was maximized. And, he even said to, I can't remember which interview it was, but he said explicitly to the person that he was interviewing that he could sit down right now and come up with a religious system that was much more rational and appropriate than any of the ones that have existed to date. And I think, well, you're falling right into that rationalist utopian pitfall there. You're just not that smart. No one can do that. And as soon as you do it, you end up where the socialists, like the radical Soviet socialists or the Nazi utopians, ended up. The whole point of objective science is to remove subjectivity. Okay, so then it gets removed and, well, you're surprised about it. It's like, well, no, you can't be surprised about it. You removed it right at the beginning. Now, that works for certain purposes. It works very well. But it has consequences, and some of those consequences, as far as I'm concerned, are serious enough to produce two forms of social and mental illness. And one of those would be the succumbing to the temptations of authoritarianism, and the other would be succumbing to the temptations of nihilism, because they're logical consequences of the definition of subjective as non-real.
Just a quick side note, does anyone need further proof that Jordan Peterson is himself a postmodernist?
So I think if a truth drives you insane, it's not a truth. There's something wrong with it. That's like a definition. But I think it's a definition that's grounded in Darwinian thinking. And I think what I think about religion is a very Darwinian. I think religion is an evolved It's evolved knowledge. Now, Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced back in the late 1800s that God was dead. And when you know that quote, Nietzsche said God was dead, but what you don't know probably is the context within which he said that in The Gay Science. He said, I paraphrase, God is dead and we have killed him and we will never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphal statement on Nietzsche's part. He predicted that millions of people would die in the 20th century as a consequence of the ascendance of communist ideology. He predicted that in like 1880. It's unbelievable. And Dostoevsky knew exactly the same thing and predicted that in The Devils, in his great book, The Devils. So we have no cornerstone in our culture. We've come unmoored. And we oscillate from the radical right, hyper-order, to the radical left, hyper-chaos. And millions of people die with each turn of the snake, let's say. We have got nothing to keep us centered. And what keeps people centered, whether they know it or not, is the logos. They just don't understand what it means. Now we're going to talk about the phenomenological, existential/phenomenological psychiatrists and their theories from the 1950s. And as I mentioned to you before, a lot of their thinking was motivated by what had happened in World War II. When I lectured to you last, I pointed out, I described Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's summation of the world situation and really the world psychological situation at the end of the 1800s, and that was that our new modes of thinking had undermined our faith in our old modes of thinking, and that was a problem because people need something firm to stand on to orient themselves and to move forward. And so Nietzsche and Dostoevsky basically both prophesied that the consequence of that dissolution would be increased probability of nihilism and everything that went along with that. Anyways, Binswanger and Boss, so they worked mostly in the 1950s, and as I said, they were very concerned about what had happened in World War II, and so Dostoevsky and Nietzsche had basically predicted that it was going to be nihilism or ideological totalitarianism, and that's basically exactly what happened.
So based on these clips, including the ones in my previous videos, here is my summary of Jordan Peterson's beliefs about religion and society as I understand them. The biblical stories are what give us our ethics and our cultural values. You cannot get rid of the biblical stories without also getting rid of the ethics that are derived from them. This is why atheists are actually believers at some level. Despite their stated lack of belief in these stories, they still act according to our common Judeo-Christian ethics. These ethics, and thus the biblical stories, ground us ideologically, whether we know it or not. Without them, we would become nihilistic, and we would oscillate between different types of ideological possession, with many people dying in the process, as we saw in the 20th century. Incidentally, the realist definition of the word truth is dangerous because it leaves out moral considerations, like the Judeo-Christian ethic that keeps us from being killed by tyrants. The realist definition of truth allows the biblical stories to be considered false, completely ignoring their moral truths and their necessity in preventing nihilism and the death that comes with it. Now, we know from evolution that, technically speaking, beliefs which keep you alive are the closest thing to truth that we have access to. Therefore, Christianity is true because it keeps us alive by fending off ideological possession. It's also morally true because it's the foundation of our morality, and moral truths are higher truths because those are the truths that ultimately guide our actions. Condensed into a formal argument, Peterson's beliefs would look something like this. Beliefs that serve life are true. Christianity is a belief that serves life. Therefore, Christianity is true. Well, hold on. Christianity is a belief that serves life, you say? Well, if and only if people believe in Christianity, then not nihilism. If not nihilism, then reduced risk of ideological possession by tyrants. If reduced risk of ideological possession by tyrants, then reduced risk of people dying. Therefore, Christianity reduces the risk of people dying. If something reduces the risk of people dying, then that thing serves life. Therefore, Christianity serves life. Now, I've already addressed Peterson's claim that Western morality and Western cultural values are derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition in my video, Jordan Peterson's Sloppy Morality. Many other YouTubers have also debunked this idea because this is something we've been hearing from religious conservatives for decades. Suffice it to say, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality under the law, the banning of slavery, the illegality of rape, and many other Western values are nowhere in the Bible, and they were not adopted because of Christianity. So that's the morality and culture claim out of the way. I've also argued against Peterson's claim that the word truth should be, or already is, defined as beliefs which serve life, in my video, Jordan Peterson's Useless Truth. And I believe I've succeeded in showing that this is not how we use the word truth, and that we could not operate under this definition of the word. As for my video, Jordan Peterson's Lazy Christianity, I think the reason why Peterson tiptoes around the literal claims of Christianity is because he believes, as I do, that there is no solid evidence for the literal truth of Christianity. But he doesn't want to say that because he still wants people to believe in Christianity for the reasons we've seen. This is also why he tries to gerrymander the definition of truth, because while Christianity can be false according to the realist and even the traditional pragmatist definitions of truth, it can be said to be true according to the Peterson definition. And if you want people to believe something, it really helps if you're able to say that the belief is true. It's just a little contradictory. It's still good. It's still good. It's just a little ambiguous. It's still good. It's still good. It's just a little unprovable. It's still good. It's still good.
It's gone.
Well, it depends what you mean by gone. So, having addressed these supporting claims, let's address Peterson's final capstone claim, the idea that a lack of Christianity creates a culture of nihilism, and that this leads to millions of people dying as a result of ideological possession by tyrants. The simplest response is, no, that doesn't happen, because Peterson has never provided any evidence for this claim. Even in one of his lectures where he opens with this assertion, specifically the idea that this chain of events was the cause of World War II, he never maps his model onto what actually happened. In his 2015 lecture on existentialism and Nazi Germany, he begins by asserting that World War II was caused by a culture of nihilism in Germany, but then he proceeds to give a non-nihilistic, practical account of what caused World War II: inflation of the German currency, resentment over the punitive Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler's talent of picking up on what his audience wanted to hear. You really need to see it to believe it. Peterson asserts that nihilism was the cause, and then he explains exactly how it happened with no reference to nihilism or a lack of Christianity. I guess you could say that perhaps a kind of financial nihilism took hold in Germany since their money was worthless, which is certainly a depressing thing that makes people eager for a solution, even if it's a bad one. But that's not nihilism. Besides, if Peterson's claims were true, then countries like Sweden, Norway, and the UK would be drowning in cultures of nihilism and meaninglessness. But they're not. In fact, generally speaking, as countries become less religious, which in the West means less Christian, they actually end up doing better by many of the metrics we use to evaluate quality of life. Where's the death, Peterson? How is Christianity serving life? My suspicion is that Peterson has started from his conclusion and worked backwards. His conclusion is the same one that American conservatives have been saying for decades. Without God, we'd have no morals. Atheism leads to misery. All the great dictators of the 20th century were atheists. You know, classic Bill O'Reilly stuff.
Some of the worst regimes ever have been atheistic. You know that. Communists under Stalin, Mao Zedong.
Nothing to do with atheism.
No, really? No. See, my hypothesis is that religion is a constraint on society.
But now that it's Jordan Peterson saying it, that somehow makes it less ridiculous. Quite the contrary, I think I've demonstrated that Peterson has made this idea even more ridiculous by supporting it with equally ridiculous arguments.